All right, are we on? Can everybody hear me? Is it saying we're live?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, brilliant. All right, so hello everybody, President Sunday here, and today I'm joined by Professor... Oh, here we go. Let's close this off. Okay, brilliant. There we go. Okay, hello everyone, President Sunday here. I am joined by Professor Clifford Bates today to talk about Aristotle and political science. Just by way of a short introduction, Professor Bates is, and please correct me if I get any of this wrong, Professor of American Studies in Poland at the University of Warsaw. He's the author of numerous articles on Aristotle and political science in particular, and 2 books, Aristotle's Best Regime, Kingship, Democracy, and the Rule of Law, and The Importance of the Regime for Political Science, both of which I highly recommend. I've linked to their Amazon pages in the description. I actually discovered Professor Bates through a pair of his articles on the centrality of politeia for Aristotle's politics while I was taking a seminar on the Nicomachean Ethics, and I've cited them in more than 1 term paper. So I have to say, it's a rather surreal honor to have you on, Professor Bates. Thank you for joining me.
You're welcome.
So just quickly for format, so just how we're going to do this is we're just going to go through some questions that I have pre-prepared here, and then
before we do that, why don't you also explain the other circumstance by which you contacted me? That'd be funny.
Oh dear, do we want to do that?
Yeah.
So I initially got to talking to Professor Bates in connection with my video critiques of The Academic Agent, and I'm not sure what were we actually talking about then. It was I think
it's not important. You were just surprised that I was sending super chats
right
to AA and asking kind of questions and things, and saying nice things sometimes. And you were saying, how can someone like you, like Academic Agent? And I said, no, I don't agree with 97. I mean, I've always found myself thinking he's simply wrong, but that's because he's really an English professor, not a specialist in politics. So or political theory. So he basically says the same thing a lot of shallow readers of political theory say about things. And trust me, the world is filled in academia, and particularly in economics faculties and philosophy faculties, of people who have a very shallow understanding of many of the classic texts of political theory. So I don't hold that against them. I can say, I think you shouldn't, so I mean, I'm not going to say he's someone so great I respect him. That's not the case. I think he's useful because he does introduce people to these ideas, as Sargon does also. But
yeah, I would agree with that. Yeah.
But at the same time, I would say they should go deeper and better. And I'm actually angry at we'll talk about this later, but I'm actually angry a lot of my peers who aren't on Facebook. And they should be. I mean, I'm just lazy. I mean, to be honest, I'm overworked, but I also am a tech phobe. I'm actually good in technology, but at the same time, I panic before. Once I'm used to it, I'm good.
Yeah.
But once it's kind of like, I'm afraid. Like I just bought a wand, one of these wands for photocopying. I've had it now for like 5 days. Have I used it yet? No. I want to use it, but I'm a little terrified. I didn't buy. I mean, it wasn't expensive, but it wasn't cheap either. It was like I think I paid 60, 80 euros for it, so it's not that bad.
The wand is in like
it's a Xerox. It's a scanner.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Yeah.
Because I was sick and tired of standing over a book with my camera, my tablet, and for 30 minutes standing over a book with trying to get the lighting right to get a cam scammer to work. So
well, you should be hosting. I'm still clicking with my phone. So
okay, so let's start. Okay.
All right. So just for format, so how we're going to do this is we're just going to go through some questions that I have pre-prepared here, and then sometime about midway through, we'll take some audio questions. And amazingly, I see that I actually have an audience today. So thank you, Professor Bates, again. And if there are audience questions later on, if we have time, we can possibly look at those in the end. So Yeah, so I've mentioned your books, Aristotle's Best Regime and the Importance of the Regime for Political Science, as well as 2 articles on Aristotle's politics. Obviously, Aristotle is a central focus for you in your recent work, definitely. So how did you get interested in Aristotle in particular?
Well, that's a funny story, because originally, I mean, I grew up on the right. Okay, I'm a child of military people and World War II vets, and even though I was from Rhode Island, which is a liberal state, we were what we call swamp Yankees, which means people who didn't live in the cities but lived in the rural areas, rural and suburban areas. I'm from an old family, a very old family there, colonial time. So although my mother's side is a Greek immigrant of the turn of the last century, the previous century, not the you know.
Yeah.
I grew up in a very, traditional conservative kind of environment, and things like this. I went to ROTC and things like this. I was reading conservative magazines as a teenager, like National Review. Also reading science fiction. I got interest in political theory in college, at both a school in New York and then later at Providence College in Providence. Just
out of curiosity, if I could just stop you quickly, what science fiction did you read? That's kind of a thing for me.
Jerry Pournelle, Robert Heinlein.
Okay.
What is it? H.P. Piper. I still love Piper.
That one.
Philip K. Dick.
Oh yeah.
If you like Pournelle, you like Piper.
Okay. I confess I don't know who Pournelle is either, but I'm going to look.
Jerry Pournelle. I mean, Jerry Pournelle is he has a doctorate in doctorate, not engineering, but in physics and computer science and not computer science, but engineering and science technology, and he has a PhD in political science. He was a very important science fiction writer in the 70s and 80s. He used to write the amateur article for Byte magazine.
Okay.
So he's he died a couple years ago. He wrote a great book called Inferno, where he took he basically did a revision of Dante's Inferno, and it's actually very worth.
I think I vaguely know what that is. Yeah. Okay.
So Pournelle and that kind of stuff. But then I got in university and I was introduced to a feminist Straussian. First, I had a traditional political theorist where we read Eberstein, which is a kind of Plato to NATO kind of summaries of political thought. Then when I went to Providence, I had an ex-priest who went to Toronto, because he was an ex-priest because he's a former recovering alcoholic. But he was a great philosophy teacher, and I had him for the Republic. A course of the Republic, but also a course on ethics and errors. But in my teenage years, I was a Lockean. Okay, I was a diehard kind of libertarian Lockean. I love Locke. I love Tom Paine, and I like Burke also. I kind of started to like Burke and resent Paine. In my college years, I became more pro Burke and much hostile to Paine. It was in my college years that I ran to Straussian, a woman Straussian who was a feminist and a Democrat, leftist. So this idea that all Straussians are right wingers was just simply just hilarious. I always laughed at it because I knew many of them, and many of them were just so very much traditional Democrats. In fact, that was one of the problems I had with the Straussians I knew, because I was so old right. They didn't trust me. Like Mort Frisch at Northern Illinois with a doctorate. When I said FDR, I had a joke. In 1933, 3 fascist leaders took power: Stalin, Hitler, and FDR. And he wrote a book defending FDR, and he was kind of offended because he was a big hit. He loved Hamilton, so he kind of gave a defense of FDR, and he was always offended by my hostility of the whole New Deal project, because he was a child of Jewish immigrants, wealthy Jewish immigrants of Chicago, not wealthy but well off. One of his sons, he went to university. He was in World War II. and then he served at the Battle of the Bulge. He was originally an anti-aircraft guy, then converted to infantry. So I mean, he served his country. He then went to university. Then he went to, with the things. He went to go to university. He had Strauss as a teacher. Wrote his dissertation. He left Strauss to make for money. Okay, he went to a different school for more money because Chicago never gave money to people in the 50s, and early 60s. It was Darwinian school. You had to live on nothing. Nothing. That changed in the 80s, but not in the 50s and 60s, it was crazy. But back to the question, how did I get in Aristotle? Yeah. Well, it's because I had the course on Aristotle with both my liberal Straussian teacher and that, but I was still a Hobbesian. I saw myself as a Hobbes-Lockean. I agreed with Strauss that Hobbes and Locke agreed there was no disagreement between this, but I believed that consent by the government. I was truly an American in that I believed in that consent by the governed was the thing. It was in not with the liberal Straussian, but with the recovering priest who, because the liberal Straussian only read 2 or 3 chapters. I mean, 2 little bits of, because we spent more time on the Republic. We had Republic, Apology, Crito, Republic, 3 weeks of Aristotle, and the rest of the time was like 1 week or 2 weeks on St. Thomas Aquinas and Augustine, and then 3 weeks on Machiavelli.
Yeah, that sounds like mine. We did 1 month on Republic. We did 1 month on the politics, and then we did the entire St. Augustine's City of God in 2 weeks. Roughly half of volume 2 of the Summa in 2 weeks, and then the Muqaddimah of Ibn Khaldun for like a day, which was ridiculous.
So I came to Aristotle at my first grad school at University of Dallas with Professor Leopold de Alvarez. If you don't know Leopold, you should know him. It was an outstanding teacher who didn't write much, but he wrote a translation of The Prince.
Okay.
Which is a very good translation. It's more literal, and some people will argue there's a new book saying that he's not as literal as he thinks he is. But it's a very awkward read. Mansfield is the famous translator. Chicago, it's more popular. Yeah. But de Alvarez it's Wayland, and then he wrote this book, The Machiavellian Enterprise, which I kind of had a little. He had de Alvarez won't publish. Okay. This was a manuscript for 10 years that he used to teach from.
Yeah.
I told my dissertation director about the manuscript, and him also being a former student. My dissertation advisor was a former student of Leopold as an undergrad.
Yeah.
So at Northern, he then went to visit him, talked to his wife. His wife stole the manuscript.
What?
And gave it to my teacher. My former promoter, and then my promoter took it to the University Press, Northern Illinois, and the editors agreed to publish it immediately. Now it took 4 years for him to kind of fix the page proofs, but eventually it got done. Okay, and it's in paperback. It's one of the best commentaries on the.
Can you actually hold it up so I can see the name fully?
It's de Alvarez, Leopold.
Oh, I see. De Alvarez, got it. Thank you.
Sorry, I'm having a problem with the camera because everything moves in the opposite direction on the camera.
Yeah, I wonder if that's StreamYard or if that's just I don't know.
It's a mirror effect.
Yeah.
Well, it's not a mirror effect. It's a reversed. It's not a mirror. It's a reversed. So it's I'm seeing it as how everyone else see it, and not as a thing as a mirror.
Oh, I see. Yeah. Gotcha. I see what you're saying.
So right. I under de Alvarez, I took 2 classes on the politics one for credit, one I just sat in on.
Okay.
Because it was a mind-blowing experience. The whole semester on the politics. And he would go, and he didn't finish always the thing. I mean, he would try to get the book 7 and 8, but sometimes he would skip because it would just get. He would just go. His style would be have someone read the passage and then go into the analysis of the thing and show the structures of the things and the different different levels of activity in it. And this cured me of my Lockeanism. And because up to this time, I wanted to write a dissertation on Burke. I was all ready to write a dissertation on Burke. I wanted to write. It was a great dissertation idea. I wanted to write about the connection between the Sublime and Beautiful, Burke's philosophic book, and his political thought. And I want to show that there was a connection between the kind of rhetoric and the kind of arguments he uses in Reflection on the French Revolution and other pieces, and his theology of in his theory of aesthetics. I'm having a problem. I don't know what it is.
Oh, you all good over there?
It's all good. No, my other computer, because I'm not touching it regularly.
I see.
It timed out, and I said, "Oh no," because I got the questions. I have to kind of refresh my questions.
Oh, gotcha. Okay, yeah.
So that was the reason why I got into politics. Another reason why I got into politics is because Aristotle's politics, because I was very much interested in biology and the way biological sciences affect human behavior. And so therefore, one was that Aristotle was a counter to the Lockean Hobbesian view of society, one. Two, Aristotle's approach to politics was very biological. And therefore, I wouldn't have to, I could be studying something very philosophical, but at the same time, can bring in biological evidence and biological approaches, and it wouldn't be alien. So that's why I studied the politics, and why I studied this question, because the first book question, because it was an amazing question about book 3. It was why was book 3 the way it was? Why did the structure of the book come up with two particular peaks of arguments that looks incomplete, but if you look at it more closely and watch the interplay between the two peaks, right, you'd come to understand the arguments that's being made. In other words, the argument is not spelled out like modern writers will do it. What happens is you have to look at the arguments and think, then work with the arguments in your mind and interact with them. And then what happens is you basically start a dialogue with the author. You actually get into a dialogue with Aristotle in a sense, not in a literal sense, but in a kind of figurative sense. Sure. And then once you follow the structure of what he's done, you're led to some conclusions, and that's how the first book came about.
So for those who aren't familiar with the politics, can you sort of explain what is different about book 3 in particular? Like, why are we isolating that one out?
It's the center. It's the center of the structure of the book. I argue, even though there's supposed to be 8 books, and there's one of the big problems in the scholarship is what is the correct ordering of book 4, 5, and 6, and 7 and 8 are doing 2 different things. 4, 5, and 6 are very practical books that deals with practical, real regimes, and 7 and 8 are kind of what is the best city? A city in prayer, the city we would pray for, and kind of like a Plato light. Okay, Plato's a public light. So therefore, some people argue that the end of book 3 leads on to book 7 and 8. So therefore, the structure should be 7 and 8 should follow book 3. But then other scholars argue that no, that 4, 5, and 6 should follow it, because it's misleading to say that only 7 would be the thing. It could also likely be the point of 8. But I argue that book 3 is the center, because the center of the book 3 is about the regime. He mentions the regime or the politeia earlier, but he only book 3. He defines it, and then it gets into the question of which of these politeias or regimes are the best, and therefore it is the only place where the term political philosophy, book 3, in the middle of book 3, is explicitly mentioned. Nowhere else in the even in the book 7 and 8, which talks about the regime of leisure and contemplation, it does not mention philosophy, okay, or political philosophy.
Yeah.
So this is why it's a structural argument. So I try to understand why book 3 is the way it is.
So tell us a bit more about the regime.
Okay, the regime is from the Greek word politeia. Okay.
Yeah.
Now this is a very complicated word because some people translate it as constitution. It's been traditionally translated as constitution. Some people translate it as government. Okay. The reason why government isn't correct as perfect, because a politeia is more than the institutional government. It is the way of life or the kind of worldview that that defines the ruling the given political community. In other words, the regime is what gives form and shape and direction to the matter of the political community. The political community is like the people in it, and the people like that. The people in it they're important, but the structure that institutions take, the structure of which part of the community is the ruling part. All these go together. What way of life is the predominant or authoritative, the one that has authority on it, and therefore that shapes the regime, and therefore of this is the politeia. Some people don't like the word regime because they say a regime is said to be authoritarian. Something authoritarian has authoritarian ring to it. But Constitution has a problem because of the written in the older language before the rise of America with its written Constitution. Today, constitutions are understood as basically only legal instruments. In older English usage, the Constitution meant your state or character, or like how was there's a saying, someone would go on their morning constitutional. That meant they weren't fighting for their rights; they were going out for a walk. Okay, because why? Because it was making them healthy. Right. It was giving it was giving their body an order. Okay, taxes that allowed them to live their lives. So therefore, but that is lost because of the legalism of the term today. So therefore, constitution is not a good word, even though some people government is some way good, but some way it's insufficient. Regime, I think it's the French word, and because it works better, but it's authoritarian. That's why some people like the word political system.
Well, I mean, even in common use, like people will say they haven't exercised regimes. There seems to be some contiguity there with that use.
Oh yeah, because the word regime is widely used regarding a structure or pattern as well. Yeah. So that's what the regime is. It's the form. It's the form. It's the form of the eidos, the structure of. Remember Aristotle's 4 causes, right? The form of the thing. Yeah. And the thing is the political community.
So just to make sure I understand you correctly, so one of the problems that I'm seeing from this is if we use the word government instead, is because that's invoking a structure in itself. That's necessarily invoking a separate kind of regime.
Well, no. The government is part of the regime, but the problem is that the say government, you're then only focusing on the institutional arrangements, not on the values and the preferences. In other words, the regime also includes the way of life, the preferred way of life.
I see.
Every regime has in it a choice of preferencing one type of life or way of life over another. So oligarchies privilege wealth making and forms of wealth making and the wealthy. Democracies tend to favor equality, but they also favor the poor. In other words, the multitude. It gives more weight to the multitude than to the elites or the wealthy. The aristocratic regimes tend to be, in practice, they are nothing more than oligarchies who, instead of praising wealth, praise education or military virtue or something like that. Then tyrannies are simply just, the guy with the gun, ruining things. In fact, that Aristotle makes a big point about in book 4, chapters 4 through 6, that there's sub variations in regimes. That there's going to be different. There's not only distinctive regimes. There's also going to be variations within a regime of different varieties of democracy, varieties of aristocracy, varieties of oligarchy, and he makes a point that the ultimate extreme of democracy and the extreme of oligarchy is similar in character to tyranny. So therefore, and the best element of democracy and the best element of oligarchy, but democracy more than oligarchy, is more perfect a regime, and therefore closer to aristocracy, a form of aristocracy.
So,
in that sense.
no, a tyrant obviously rules by force. He has the gun, but I mean, to a certain
extent, some Greek tyrants were ruled consensually, because tyranny usually meant this illegitimate rule that you didn't have the right to be the ruler. So in other words, they broke the law, and that there's no law anymore. Tyrants only rule by their own decree. They overrule the legal structures.
So what distinguishes a tyrant from a founder?
That's a big question itself. Plato would argue nothing. Plato and his laws argue nothing. Plato says, "Give me a young tyrant," right? In Plato's laws. But in Aristotle, it's more problematic. He says, beginning of book 4, he says, well, it's very important. He said in book 1, chapter 1, it's a very good thing that the person who creates the city, this person gave us the great benefactor. So founders of cities are great benefactors. But maintaining a city, keeping a city alive, is more difficult and requires more skill than founding. So, in that sense, founding can be done by people who are imperfect, but then they have to leave. They stay and they come up. What ends up happening is that they end up corrupting the city. That's why Solon had to leave. But then what happened was, once he left, the oligarchs took over, and then that led to the tyranny, right? And then comes Themistocles, and I can't say the other guy's name, the Democratic founder, Cleinices, I can't say it.
Oh, Cleisthenes.
Cleisthenes, yes.
Yeah.
Cleisthenes establishes democracy again, and then and with that new democracy, much more open to the workers.
Yeah.
That then all of a sudden Themistocles emerges out of the working class, out of that class, the skilled craftsman class, and becomes a great leader. So therefore, the different types of democracy. Solonian was more kind of aristocratic democracy, or more of a farmer democracy, and where Cleinices' democracy is more a kind of a workman democracy, the craftsman democracy. So again, these are the variations of democracy. Like we could say America at the time of up until the 20th century was a agrarian democracy mostly. And that defined the character. Starting with the 1880s and 1890s, industry became more powerful. It was only in the 20th century, 1920s and 1930s, 1930s and 40s, and the Second World War, that industry started to overtake agriculture in America. And that led in the 1960s to the court challenging in Baker versus Carr the proportional in the states, the way state governments proportion legislatures for their assemblies, because rural area, the founding fathers even agreed with Aristotle in Book 6, saying that if you don't, urban Democrats, the urban poor is worse than the rural poor. Rural poor is self-sufficient, urban poor isn't, and the urban poor is rapacious. So therefore,
do you mind if I disappear for just 1 second? I'm just gonna.
Okay, no problem.
Thank you.
Well, that's why I can finish that point. The urban poor is simply rapacious, and because of that, it leads democracy to extremes, to the worst forms of democracy. So if you want to have good democracy, you have to rig the system to allow the rural areas to have more representation. hence why the Senate. That's why in American Senate there's equal representation in every state, so that poor, smaller population states that are rural have equal weight in the Senate to a big population state, and therefore that preserves the poor, the rural poor's moderation, preserves the character of the regime. Otherwise, the regime will decay into a mass democracy, which simply just demands what it wants. Very similar to the condition in Hobbes's state of nature. In the Hobbes's state of nature, you have every man has the right to whatever they want, and that leads to the war of all against all. And this leads to complete horror that everyone wants to. And Hobbes, this leads to this warfare and conflict that it's so bad that humans want to escape from it, flee. They want peace, so therefore they're willing to give up their liberty, they give up the right to whatever they want to do this. So therefore, even though Aristotle and Hobbes are completely different in many ways, what Hobbes sees as his fear, the state of nature, is the consequence of a radical democracy. When democracy gets to the point where the law doesn't matter anymore, and the people can have whatever they want, and they're the rulers. This leads to a situation, and particularly when the urban poor. Aristotle makes this big point about the urban poor, rural poor, because there's something bad. The poor have a problem. That is their lack of resources. In fact, the word poor is a kind of alpha privative of the word resources, lacking resources.
Really?
A prior means resources or goods or means, the means of living your life, to survive.
Interesting. Yeah. Okay.
And therefore, the poor are porios, into the noun form. That means without resources. And the rich, EU means well. They're exceedingly well possessed of resources.
Yeah.
And he says that the poor are, because they lack and they have nothing, they're more passive and slavish. And the rich, because they have everything, they tend to command and demand. And therefore, a society needs a mean between these two extremes, because a society where everyone is rich and commanding is a very not pleasant place, and a place where everyone is poor is one is going to be envious and wishing to take away from those who have, and will be rapacious when they have power. So therefore, the Aristotelian argument is that you want the many or the multitude not to be poor, but you want them to have the means to have enough to survive. And therefore, the rural poor, because they have the access to the means of feeding themselves, are capable of having resources that the urban poor don't have, and only rely on their physical labor and an economy. So, like, trust me, in this virus problem, and if let's say it lasts for a long time and the supply chain things, rural America and rural Canada is going to go on normal. The big cities, it's going to be Omega Man, or they'll start eating each other. They'll start killing each other, because why? They can't feed themselves. They can't supply themselves. They don't have the means. Even the wealthy will sooner or later their money won't be enough, because they won't be able to buy things. People just simply come there, and if they don't have the means to convince people with guns to protect them, then they will be the first. And the worst thing that happen is people with guns will take the stuff from them. So that's why it's like that. So let's go back to the question. We answered, I think we answered up to kind of up to 4 now.
Yeah. So, right. Okay. So, going on to the actual discipline of political science today, we don't, specifically American political science, you never hear talk of the regime. It certainly doesn't center the regime as some kind of orienting principle for what we're studying. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Well, it depends on if you study domestic politics, or Canadian politics or American politics. You're right, but if you're studying foreign policy, international relations, regimes are very big because if you want to the regime is okay. You have to understand what the character of the regime is. The regime is not a state. The political community of old, either the polis or civitas, was a discrete unit of parts, autonomous parts. And the political community is not a unitary entity. Rather, it's a collection of discrete parts where one or two parts claim to rule on behalf of the whole. And usually if the other parts consent to it or agree to it or don't fight about it, it works. But sometimes they don't like it, and the ruling part is simply stronger. It has usually the ruling part usually has the part that has the arms, okay, the means to protect particularly the armed element supports them. And when a regime that lacks the armed element won't last long.
Yeah.
Therefore, the dominant part will control it. Therefore, change always occurs when there's some imbalance or breakdown in the system of support. Okay, where modern state theory rests on this concept of the collective will, because it comes from Locke and Hobbes, that the political body is created by all the constituted members who consent to create society and political society. In fact, that's the big problem in modern political thought, is the problem of what is society to the relationship of the state. Because for early modern thinkers, state and society are synonymous concepts occurring at the same time.
Yeah.
So therefore, and that leads to lots of problems in political thought that are still plaguing much of modern political science. Some of the solutions were to divide the state and society separate entities, like Rousseau and Montesquieu and Tocqueville, but that then creates even more problems, because as the state gets more powerful, it seeks to control this. And the purpose of the situation was to avoid the Middle Ages. The reason why Machiavelli created the state, or coined the concept of the state, was to overcome the environment of the Middle Ages, where political rule was destroyed with the collapse by the creation of the empire, or Caesar coming into power. The republic died, and that political power became nothing more than the rule of a household, Caesar.
Yeah.
And then and an empire. Caesar ruled Rome, and originally Rome ruled the empire. The Roman Republic ruled the empire.
Yeah.
But that once Caesar used his power in the empire to seize Rome, Rome ceased being a republic and just became whoever governed the household of Caesar controlled Rome. Okay, but they also had to control the army. So therefore therefore that became the problem. Therefore, when the empire broke down, and the Middle Ages emerged, there was no one seat of power anymore. There was no one seat of authority or power. There were multiple. There was the church, the state. There was cities. There were cities and like the Danish cities and like Gdansk and the Asiatic cities. There were cities like in Venice and Florence that were still kind of surviving in the Middle Ages. There were tribes, tribal leaders. There was households became. What do you think baronial estates are nothing more, baronial or aristocratic estates are nothing more than a form of the Greek oikos, a household. So therefore, the household took on a very political rule. So didn't parental rule because of the connection of it. So therefore, the Middle Ages is a world of all this pluralistic political systems or forms of community that are competing with each other to rule, and sometimes this leads to chaos. And that's Machiavelli's criticism of this. And he said, we need to have one authority in charge of everything. That's the state.
Yeah.
Hobbes' solution to this is, well, I have a solution to this. Machiavelli didn't care about justice, but I do. So how are we going to make the state just? Well, the solution is, what is the just? Well, the just is consent.
Right.
If people consent to it, it's just. So therefore, Hobbes solves the answer of classical political philosophy, what is just, with the answer of consent. And consent is also the mechanism by which the society emerges and is created through the social contract. So he kills two birds with one stone. And all of modern political thought follows from this. But also, all modern political thought has to deal with the mess that Hobbes, to get the solution, he had to deal with a lot of, he left a lot of things unprobable about the family. Is the family totally based on consent or not? Are all social relationships voluntary, or are there some just non-consensual relationships?
So earlier you mentioned the distinction between household and political rule. So Machiavelli wanted to bring back political rule.
Overall, because not because of household, but because there was just too many. There was no one locus of authority.
Right.
In the Greek world, there was a locus of authority. That was the polis. That was the civitas. That changed in the empire, because the empire, the household, or either the empire is simply all empires are despotic in their character. They have to be. That's the nature of empire. Therefore, because they don't rule by consent, they may be beneficial accidentally, or maybe purposely beneficial if they have a kind of Christian or Islamic understanding. Islam and Christianity come both with the notion of the ruler having to sacrifice himself. So the king has to sacrifice his good for the benefit of the others, like the father. So therefore, the Christian notion of kingship is a kind of sacrificial kingship. So therefore, it's not a kingship of benefiting himself in that sense. So therefore, the medieval, Islamic rule can have an empire in that where the ruling element can be done for the sake of the greater glory, not of the ruling element or the family or even of the part, but of the whole, the larger picture. Same thing. So therefore, that's why the Christian emperor, that's why the Christian, the Capitolate in the Islamic, all of these things had a situation. Therefore, the theological or the God unified power. But once that died, in fact, the Middle Ages died because once the emperor and the Pope started fighting, and it was no clear, and actually as the Western part of the empire just ran into anarchy, and the authority of the emperor became null and void in the West. That led to a situation where everything happened, and therefore whatever worked. If households were the source of authority, they ran, and then therefore this is why feudalism emerged, because feudalism was a temporary stopgap solution to a crisis.
Yeah.
And therefore that's the Middle Ages. Now Machiavelli hates this because there's all these competing realms of authority. And this is very similar to Hobbes's problem. Too many competing realms of authority leads to conflict and strife and not progress. So therefore, you need to have a central locus of authority, and that's the state. The state will be it. For Machiavelli, it is a person, or it is either the prince or the rulers of a republic, the governing body of the republic, or the prince. But for Hobbes, he moves the state away from a person, and makes it the body politic. It's it's a constituted thing of all the members. So who is the state? It's everyone who forms it is the state. And what is the general will? It's the collective will of all the community. That's sovereignty. Sovereignty is the power that everyone gives, everyone when they surrender their own power to form the state, give up the right to do whatever they want for the sake of security and their life and their possessions. They then get progress, happiness, security, but they lose their sovereignty. They give up a significant portion of their power. Now this might be good, because having absolute sovereignty may not be good for us. Every single individual may not be good to be a sovereign or capable of being a sovereign. Yeah. So therefore, that way. But there's
something almost like. Go on, please.
So modern political science is like at the turn of the 1930s and 40s, ran away because it was in the 1800s and 1900s. The state was the big thing. Starting in the 1930s with the rise of the American behavioralists at Chicago, and then later Stanford and Yale, and 1930s with people like Laswell and Charles Merriam. Harold Laswell's famous book is still famous. It's Politics: Who Gets What, Where, and When. Right? Laswell combined structural functionalism of the Chicago sociological school with some kind of elements of economics with a Thurston Veblen kind of approach of economics, more Veblen than classical liberal. Then with Freud, Freudian psychology to explain the system. So that's behavioralism. That's the behavior. And behavioralism took control of politics with the New Deal. And World War II, the behavioralists took control over foreign policy. It was after World War II and during the Cold War, the behavioralists ran much of American foreign policy. Remember, I mean, if you know the origins of the CIA, the behavioralists played two groups: the behavioralists, the professors of Yale at Yale University and Columbia, and political science of that, plus the exiled German Marxists of the so-called Frankfurt School. They were recruited in the OSS, and the OSS's policy team became the formation of the CIA in 1946-47. So therefore, the logic and modeling of the policy approaches and the way they understand politics was totally shaped by behavioralism. In fact, behavioralism, the Social Science Research Council and Rand Foundation and other things like this ran much of American foreign policy in Vietnam. Development policy and things like that. I mean, and actually, what really destroyed behavioralism? You ask me, why is today political science so divided, and so they don't have a theory or approach? That's because of Vietnam. The Vietnam War made because most of the professors were liberal, but the funny part was the liberals were running Vietnam. Vietnam was a liberal enterprise. That's why I'll never forgive fucking Nixon for trying to silence the Pentagon Papers. If I was Nixon, I would have put the Pentagon Papers on front foot. This is what those fucking Democrats did to you. It would have destroyed the credibility of the Democratic Party. It would have led to the congressional caucus the Democrats losing the caucus. He said that, listen, Johnson lied, and he lied, he didn't necessarily lie to Congress. Much of the Democratic leadership knew they were selling lies to the people. So I wouldn't have suppressed it. I would have played it as a political weapon and destroyed the Democratic Party. But Vietnam did destroy the Democrats. The Democratic Party was taken over by the anti-war party by 72. That's why we had that, and then therefore that's the real reason. So and actually because of the professor, was so democratic, the younger professors waged war in other words, the younger professors became more radical, and they attacked the more liberal the higher ups, and that's why many of those higher up liberals became so-called in the 80s neocons, because they were anti-communist still. Because remember, anti-communism was much a liberal phenomena as it was a right-wing phenomenon.
Yeah.
So do you want to take some? We answered a lot of it's up to 6. So I want to do your questions, I think.
Oh yeah, sure, please. Sorry, I was. Yeah, that was really interesting. Question 6 you want to do? Sure. So
let's do audience. We kind of did 6.
Oh, I see. Gotcha. Okay. Sure. So what have we got here? Scroll up.
Let's take audience questions.
There was a good one here I'm trying to find. Here we go. How would you rate the Machiavellians?
Oh, Burnham's book is fantastic.
Yeah.
It was his first really move. James Burnham was a very interesting fellow. He was a philosopher at, I think, Columbia University at the time, a young philosopher. And he was very connected to radical socialist parties. In fact, he was basically on the phone all the time to Trotsky.
Yeah.
Now, some people say, well, he was the original neocon. Well, not really, because he wasn't Jewish. He was an intellectual. But he was, his criticism was, he thought the problem of capital, he always thought the problem of capitalism, and this is seen in his 1941 book, The Managerial Revolution, that Marx got it wrong. The structure, the thing that would destroy capitalism was not alienization of labor and the abuse of the workforce.
Yeah.
And that the working classes were never going to be really revolutionary power. This was nonsense. That's why you always had to come up with dictatorship of the proletariat and the vanguard character of the party and Leninist thought. Okay, you needed Leninist thought, because remember Marx's structure. The best person who kind of gets Marx right is Alexander Kojève, who argues that communism will emerge out of capitalism working. In other words, there's not going to be a real revolution. The revolution will be simply that. In fact, in many ways, modern capitalism is communistic. Why? Because who controls the means of capital? Who owns the capital? 80% of all corporate stocks are owned by trust of mutual funds and pension plans. And who owns the pension plans? Workers and average people. You know, anyone who has a 401k or a retirement plan or a kind of a mutual fund. So who controls capital now? It's not the capital, not the capitalist class, not the people, not the entrepreneurs, and not the owners of the owners of the stock. No. Who makes it? Managers, and that was the big thing. What the Machiavellians were, Burnham's Machiavellians, was a wonderful moment where he brings to explain the importance of thinking of the so-called Italian school. Robert Michaels, Vilfredo Pareto, and Genovino Massa. In fact, I'll even show you that. I have Mosca's. I have first.
Please do.
This is what year is as a university student, a 1939. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, there you go.
1939 copy, one of the first English translations of Mosca's The Ruling Class.
Huh.
And I was reading Mosca in the 80s, okay? So mid 80s. And James Burnham I read in, because James Burnham used to write for the National Review. And therefore, I was reading his articles right when I was a teenager and then in college. So he stopped writing in the mid 80s because he got kind of old and tired.
Have you seen the academic agent videos in the Managerial Revolution? What'd you think?
Yeah, they're good. I mean, I think they do him justice. Academic agent he's good at explaining the work of others.
Well,
he doesn't really add anything original in his. I'm waiting to review the book. I'm waiting to review the book. I'm desperate to read. I got the book. The people at Vogelenview agreed to let. But the problem is, I'm still going to have to buy the book. Simply because Vogelenview will want to send me an e-book, and although I do use e-books for students, I don't like reading. I don't really like reading e-books. And Palmgrave is a rip-off company because they charge like ridiculous amounts for a 200-page book.
Yeah, isn't it like 120 American?
Yeah.
It's something crazy.
It's the motto of the books is that only libraries are going to buy it. Okay.
Yeah.
And honestly, I don't think Academic Agent thought this out because I think he if it was a cheaper book, he could sell a lot, and it would actually be more popular of a book. And I'm going to make that point. I'm going to say this. I'm going to out him in the review, not because I hate him, but I think it's because I
Oh.
think it's time that he came out. Because it's not good for a person to hide behind. Okay, yes, a Medicare or someone like that who's just a kind of a person who's not trying to be a really influence. He influences people, but doesn't really want to. Okay, he has no intention to change people. But once you really try to define opinion and try to lead people, then maybe people should know who you are. Particularly in the are you really? I mean, I agree with Ryan Falk that argues that, trust me, most PhDs are not the people who write them, and what things they say is not no better than toilet paper and mostly crap anyways. What's in them is crap, and will never see the light of day. Only 10% of dissertations get published in America. Now in Europe, more do. Europe almost 70% does, because the publishing criteria in the European system is much more liberal. Every school has its own house publishing, and everyone publishes. This is not the way Anglo-American. The rule in America only it was strict peer review. Now the problem is globalization is bringing the bad habits of the European academics to the world. The Europeans shaped the Asian and Africans, and therefore it's crap scholarship, crap, no control. Everything gets, publishing in India. My God, anything can get published in India. And remember, the big global publishing firms started mostly in India.
Yeah,
really. When Bloomsbury bought a publishing house in India, it became Indian Bloomsbury. And then what's globalism, and therefore they moved. And what happened was in the 1990s, most of the big firms moved their publishing to India or in Asia because it was cheaper. And technology allowed the easy distribution of text, digital texting, right? You could design the text. You can the local editors can still do it near the professors, right? I'm sorry, this hand. The local professors can still contact the editors, and then the editors ship by electrical to the presses back in India or China, and then they make the copies and they sell it. Even now, I joke, a lot of books are published in Poland. They get to me. I order a book in the United States and I order from Amazon, and who's the pub? Cambridge University books are published on. Some books are published on demand, and they're a little pricey because of that. And because of that, Amazon makes an arrangement with publishers in like Poland and Czech Republic and near their market, and it's done within like a 24. So I get a book 3 days later. I'll get I order the book. They'll say 6 to 8 weeks. Okay, because from America, and the next thing I know, a week later, it's on my door, and I look back. Oh, published in. I thought they shipped it by first class mail. I didn't pay. Now, that's why I think I'm kind of skeptical of the COVID-19 shipping rates. Amazon is looting. I think Amazon is taking advantage of our misperception of their practices, and like the price up here. Or at the same time, it's because of medical services and things like that. Shipping firms are prioritizing medical stuff and not.
Oh God, I'm going on to an EBL stream to talk about Zizek's the Sublime Object of Ideology, and I can't get my copy for like a month, judging from how Prime's been the last little while.
Mm-hmm. So, any questions from the audience? More?
Yeah, let's look. I know Jalma had one.
Dead air is not good.
No, it is not. Yeah, I'm just reading through the chats here. Keith Woods asks, what does Dr. Bates think about efforts to recover natural law by people like Finis?
Finis is I don't like Finis because I think he's sloppy. He ultimately combines natural rights with natural law. And in many, I call this there's a big cult in the American right around certain West Coast Straussians for they want to rescue Hobbes and Locke through Aristotle. So they create Lockistotle. I call it Locke. Peter Lawler, late Peter Lawler, from postmodern conservatism, and he was a very good friend of mine. He was older than me, but he died a couple years ago, very early. In fact, it's a shame because he just took editorship of Modern Age and would have really been a great editor of Modern Age. But Peter coined the term Lockistotle, and I run with it because I this idea that if Aristotle was alive at the time of Locke was, he would basically be writing like Locke. Please. And Finnis is similar to this. Finnis is, and that's like Robbie George is kind of that school also. This kind of analytic, this idea of analytic philosophy, which is kind of too logical, and it privileges kind of this kind of rationality and logic over kind of the fact that political life is messy. And it overstates. It assumes that the Greeks and the Romans actually gave answers. When if you look at the Greek and Roman philosophers, often the answers they gave kind of point to more questions and not as definitive answers. Yeah. Where the Christians had answers, okay, and the moderns had answers. Remember, modernity is a form of Nietzsche is right. Modernity is nothing more than a form of secularized Christianity.
Yeah, I'd agree.
And that's that. But the point he asked to about Finnis, I just never liked Finnis because I think he was always this. Anyone who would confuse in his natural right and natural law book in the 60s and 70s. I remember reading it and saying no, read Strauss. Actually, there's a very good by a Catholic thinker called Roman. It was called Natural. The German title is The Eternal Recurrence of Natural Right. The English translation is Natural Law. It's available at Liberty Fund. Yeah, he was a Catholic lawyer in the 1930s who had to flee Hitler. Apparently, if I remember, it's another one or two of these conservative Catholics had a run in with Schmidt because they were part of the Central Party, and they felt Schmidt betrayed Catholic principles by attacking the Central Party. This is before even Schmidt became a Nazi. Apparently, one of them, the guy who ran, the editor who set up the magazine Review of Politics at Notre Dame, he literally threw Schmidt down a flight of stairs.
What?
In Berlin.
Like physically threw him down a flight of stairs. Yeah,
that's the story. And he became a hero among the Catholic right because of that.
That's insane.
Because the Catholic right was anti-Nazi. And it was the Catholic right led the kind of idea of human rights. It was people like Maritain and Yves Simon, these French existentialist quasi-Thomists, were a principle of shaping the so-called Universal Convention of Human Rights with Eleanor Roosevelt. So therefore, this Catholic natural law theory has a lot to answer for. The Catholics in America were the principal agents demanding that school prayer stop in the 1950s, because school prayer in America before the 1950s was Protestant. Okay, remember the riots in Baltimore in the 1840s, 1848, 46, 47. There's Baltimore riots that were so bad. The Catholic riots were so bad that the compromise was to allow the Catholics to go to parochial schools. Yeah. So that's why from the 1830s up until the 1960s, America had two scopes of education. Public schools where the blacks and the Protestants would go, and a Catholic parochial system in Catholic universities that where Catholics would go. And only with the rise of Kennedy, and after the 60s, when that system broke down, all of a sudden, I went to a Catholic. My father was alive. He would never have wanted me to go to Providence. He would have insisted I go to Brown or other things. And where in the sense that this is Protestant. You're not supposed to go to Catholic school. I went to Providence not because I like Catholics. It's just I hated communists, and Brown was basically filled with communists, commie pinkle scum, and it was just this was the about the time it was the I think it was Amy Carter was going to Brown. No, she didn't go to Brown. She went to Brown afterwards, but so didn't John Jr. went to Brown. Okay. JFK Jr. went to no. He didn't go to, I mean, one of the Kennedys went to Brown. Two of Kennedys went to Brown. I remember that. I think it was John Jr. went to Brown. He might have went to Harvard. I remember a Kennedy was going there, and I said, "Who?" I got admitted. I went to the summer the summer prep thing.
Yeah.
I was just so disgusted with the unisex bathrooms and showers. I just said. I just went to Providence and I took my application package from Brown and just went there after the courses and I got accepted. So I went to Brown. I went to Providence because I went to school in New York for about a year and a half, and I was thinking about going to IBM recruited me. I was sent to a school. It was a Catholic school. I was surprised by it. It didn't sound like it, but it was a number one. The school advertised it was a recruiter for IBM and the CIA, and that was the thing. Oh, cool! That'd be kind of cool. In fact, the RA was a former CIA guy.
Yeah.
They were liberal. I was surprised by that. It was the shock of my life was meeting all the CIA guys who were so far leftist. I was like, dang. Wow. That kind of cured me of thinking the CIA was anything but a bunch of leftists. And as one of the heroes in my intellectual career, Wilmore Kendall, Buckley's teacher at Buckley's teacher at Yale.
Yeah.
He was he was in the OSS. He wrote all the books of Latin America. That stayed the case books on Latin America his books lasted were written in 1930s and not 1940s, sorry, 47, 48. They lasted into the 1960s and 70s. That's how good they were. But Kendall had a line about the CIA. You'd always know a CIA operation. Why? Because everyone but the target died.
Huh.
The record of the CIA was of incompetence and fucking up beyond all belief. In fact, that's the history of Americans. Americans do intelligence badly. We're horrible at intelligence.
I like that quote.
The only thing we do good in intelligence was signal intelligence, but we stole that from the British and the Poles. The British stole it from the Poles, and the Americans stole it from the British, and then we ran with it. Getting access to the Ultra Code was one of the principal things of America giving aid in 1940 to the British. And then once we had access to Ultra and the Enigma system, we were able to break code like anything. And America was always good at signal intelligence and satellite intelligence. But normal human intelligence, operations, stuff like that, Americans suck. So no more questions?
Yeah, we do actually. There's an interesting one here actually. I hope I get this right from Jama Bayorn. So here we go. So if you take a Machiavellian reading of sovereignty, in theory the sovereign could be imposed on a society externally. This is what happens in the instance of war. If the cultural interior of one group is radically different than the conquering group, the sovereign has to legitimate themselves. How does this fit into the current discussion? How can a sovereign come from without and adapt to gain power within?
The problem is, the modern world post Machiavelli argues that's impossible because it's consent solves two problems. It solves the legitimacy crisis because what is legitimacy is the question of justice, right?
Yeah.
If justice equals consent, therefore, what is legitimate is the things that we consent to.
Right.
And it also solves the origin question of political authority. That is, the source of authority comes from the people's consent, the creation of sovereignty. That's the big difference. Machiavelli understands sovereign. See, the problem is sovereignty is a weird thing. it's a medieval. John Bodin, in his 6th book, is the coiner of the term sovereignty. It's an adjective. Okay, it's from the word savron, which is the king, or not the king, but the ruler, or the crown in that sense.
Okay.
In fact, this is you're Canadian. Canadian and English, British political thought. The most important political concept of much of English political history is the crown. Parliament is Parliament, the crown in Parliament, right?
Yeah.
And the courts are independent of the crown and the crown encompasses executive rule, parliamentary rule, and judicial rule. And therefore the crown holds the sovereignty in that sense.
Mm-hmm.
So the concept of sovereignty emerges out of medieval political thinking. That's why the German scholar Ernst Kantorowicz, I think I say his name, the King's Two Bodies is such a very important work in this regard. Kantorowicz talks about the role of the king, and that's why Shakespeare's watch the Hollow Crown series to understand the medieval kingship and the tension between the death of Richard II is a transition from this medieval kind of rule and the beginning of modern rule. The need of the king to legitimize himself through parties consenting him, particularly the new merchant classes. So therefore, modern world works differently. See, Machiavelli is a transitional figure in that sense. His idea of the prince being this. First of all, Machiavelli didn't care about justice because what's expedient matters most. Yes, this doesn't mean he's advocating do bad things. He says, do what works.
Yeah.
Do what works, and care more if it works than whether it's nice. Yeah. In fact, being nice can actually I would argue that Machiavelli is more right than wrong because if you look at American foreign policy fuck-ups, it's because we're too nice. We should be more. It's better to be feared than loved. And in fact, this is the secret of Locke and Hobbes. The whole modern logic of the modern social structure rests on fear.
Yeah.
The fear of having the social system break down and everything returning to chaos. Yeah. So therefore, without fear of the thing, the state has no power. The state is the power of the state is the people's collective will, and that legitimizes that aspect. So therefore, modern states, there's no problem of legitimacy in the modern state as long as the modern state recognizes that the people are the sovereign. Now, it can be ruled by a king. The administration can be as much centralized as this. But it's because it just doesn't, the form or variety, that's why the regime plays no role in modern state. This is why the concept of regime disappears, and the rise of the concept of the state as a political concept.
This actually leads into, there's another question here that sort of relates to that actually. What does Dr. Bates think of corporatism? And Didi suggests, I think it's hijacked capitalism. Any thoughts on that?
Corporatism is a form of authority where the idea is that it's kind of arises out of a radical reading of Catholic subsidiarity teaching. The idea that every sphere of society should have a say into the decision of the system. It's a very medieval concept.
Yeah.
The medieval world, there was different spheres. The sphere of the sacred, the sphere of the divine, the sacred and divine, and the secular. The secular, you had the king or the emperor, and then you had the cities. Then you had the barons and the feudal lords.
Yeah.
And then you had these are competing sources of authority, in that sense. Therefore, what happens with Machiavelli is Machiavelli says this is bad. His solution is that one part used the state, the Stato, is his new modes and orders to give unity to the system. This is the way a part could rule the whole in a more effective structure. What Hobbes and Locke and Rousseau and Hegel and Kant and everyone else after him do, they say, hey, wouldn't it be better to move it from being a part to having the authority of the whole, and therefore we get rid of the legitimacy crisis?
Yeah.
And that's why there's no. This is why modern state really doesn't really have the legitimization crisis. The legitimization crisis only occurs when the political system there's a gap, real serious gap between what the people really want, right?
Yeah.
What the people really want and what the state institutions want. There's a disconnect between when state and society become so at odds, it becomes clear that the system there's something wrong.
Yeah.
And that's when the legitimacy of the system is defaulted. So, I mean, corporatism is not a good solution. Corporatism is just, what do you think leftism is? Leftism likes corporatism. Why? Because it's the rule of, corporatism actually gives elites within each spectrum of each group. In fact, this is Robert Michaels in his book Political Parties explain that this idea that worker unions, worker parties, socialist working parties, and parties of the industrialists were going to, the leadership of them were going to be different. No, they go to school together. They will marry each other because they're the stakeholders of power, and therefore they're going to have more in common among the different party leaderships. I mean, they're going to pick people to be effective as a leader. You're going to have to be part of the system who governs and structures. So corporatism would only make the managerial problem worse, not better. It would really fundamentally institutionalize it, and actually would destroy people's power in the sense that the people could not make the same claim that we are the sovereign. We are truly the sovereign in the modern state. The modern state is the people who have the ultimate authority. And if the people get consciousness and revolt against that, they will scare that part. That's the whole point about it. This is why Burnham was he was sympathetic to what Trotsky was up to against Stalin and Lenin, but he understood that Trotsky was just as authoritarian and just as a thug as the rest. That's why he kind of distanced himself from them. And then when Trotsky wouldn't condemn Stalin and hit for that, he kind of really distanced himself totally. Even if Stalin had Trotsky killed, Trotsky never came out and condemned the Soviet Union for the Hitler-Stalin pact, 38, 39, or the Finnish War. Okay, so therefore that's the.
Is that loyalty or fear?
No, I think he believed in this. He still believed in he just thought he agreed Lenin was the right guy, but Stalin was a deviation from Lenin. The problem is that there's a very famous history of Lenin by a former KGB general that was written in the 1990s. I forget the name. It's up here someplace, hiding one of my many books. On Lenin, but the English translation, it cuts out all this good stuff. The Russians better in that sense. All the digressions in the Russians are much better. Lenin, this idea that Lenin was Stalin deviated from Lenin, that's nonsense. Stalin was everything Stalin did, Lenin did. Okay, the purges started under Lenin, not under Stalin. Stalin just took it to a more extreme.
Yeah. So Jelma Bayern asks, this one's interesting. So did Caesar's ascension lead to the legally patrician view of Rome we currently have, or did that reality precede Caesar? And then I think it continues.
See, the Roman example is bad because the Roman society always had a client patronage system, even during the Republic. Even at the early Republic, Rome always had this kind of system of clients and patrons. That really the real citizens were the senators. The senators were the deliberative body. Everyone in the senatorial class participated, like Athens, in the Senate. Whereas, but the people had a right to vote, or not necessarily vote, but veto selections of consuls. And what happened was when the tribune, what happened was when the fight between the cities, they created the tribunes as the people's representatives, and the number of tributes would change over time. We have to remember Caesar was not a council. Yeah, he was a council at some time, but he was also, he came into power from the tribunate power. And in fact, when Caesar took power, he held, when he after the, he crushed Pompey in the first civil in the the fight with Pompey, and killed the Senate and took rule by himself. Caesar took all the consulships. He ruled as dictator, which was dictators were temporary, but he kept it permanent. And he took all the consulships and all the tribunates. So he was the only. Caesar was divine in the sense that because the tribunate was divine. Yeah. And therefore, you couldn't touch a tribune. If you touch a tribune, that would be a crime against the gods, and you could be killed. To touch the tribunes was a very not good thing. So the Roman system is completely different, and I think it's wrong to understand patronage as this. Patronage is a cultural phenomenon of some society. The Greeks didn't have we look at ancient Greeks. The Greeks didn't have patron relationships. Like Asia and China and Asia. In other words, I would argue that a civic culture. You could even patronage systems are patrimonial in their characteristic, in the sense that you need to have. And remember, this is why we have our system of law. We have lawyers representing us. This comes from Rome, because only the senator class could sit in the court. So you couldn't. Where in Athens, anyone could go in front of the court and argue their case. And in Athens, every person was his own lawyer. The idea that you would have to have a professional person be a lawyer, that's Rome. Okay, we get that from Rome, not from Greece. Greek law was much more radically democratic, much more. Greece was much more participatory because of the size of political life was limited to the polis. Yeah. Whereas Rome, as it grew more and more, political rule went beyond the communitas. It merged onto the level of the social relations with the other cities and other tribes of Rome.
Off the top of your head, do you know what the difference in scale was in terms of how many people we're talking here?
Oh, Greece, Athens at most would have only 20,000 people would be citizens at the most. In a city of maybe 90,000 with more slaves. A dozen, another group, another 34,000 people, probably 30 to 40,000 people as people who were considered slaves, who had no property, had nothing, and sold themselves to survive. Sold themselves as a means of survival, and therefore they would work on the farms of the small farmers, or they would as just small poor farmers. Both in Greece and Rome. That's the model of the ancient world, with small farms. The success of the Republic's success in defeating Carthage and Greece led to the creation of super farms, plantations, or these big super farms, which destroyed agriculture and destroyed civic life. I mean, you can say the Republic fell when that the poor could no longer live as farmers. They had to go to the cities because the farms were all bought up by the rich and used slaves to farm them. Whereas the small farmers couldn't compete, and therefore they had to go off either in the military, or they would go into the city to sell their labor or their body as a laborer to the highest bidder.
It's getting pretty late for you. Shall we take one more question?
No, we can go on. I'm not problem. It's not really late. It's only.
Oh, okay. Good.
It's
good
only 8. I can go another half hour.
Oh, brilliant. Okay, perfect. Then we're good. I just see one more here that we didn't touch on, and I have a feeling what your answer is going to be. Does Bates believe that virtue has any place in politics?
It depends. Yes, I mean, virtue means doing the right thing. Actually, I see. I understand virtue not in a Roman way, but more in a Greek way. It's, in other words, virtue is doing a thing or an action beautifully, well. I'm old, so Michael Jordan, when Michael Jordan was at his prime as a basketball star,
Yeah.
When he was playing his game at his best, that is virtue. When a person is doing virtue or excellence, arete, is the doing of a thing, doing it well, doing it perfectly, with the right direction. There's many virtues. The virtues are variety. So what do you mean by politics requires virtue? Politics requires judgment. Yes, right. Good prudence and good judgment is a virtue. It's a virtue of the mind, and yes, that's important. But Aristotle even makes an argument that, listen, the many, as long as they're not slavish, as long as they're not slavish, deliberate collectively better and make better decisions than the few wise or even the one wise.
Yeah.
So in fact, Aristotle predates the so-called wisdom of the many, or the wisdom of the multitude argument. The wisdom of the that famous book, the wisdom of mobs, right? Wisdom of the thing. That New York Times author Solosky or something. In 2004 or something like that. The argument of these markets. That what is the market really? See, this is what people don't understand what the free market is. The free market is nothing more than, that's why I get upset with libertarians. They cultivate it. The market is nothing more than an aggregation of all the simple exchanges. In fact, there's a line. There's no such thing as the economy. What is the economy? The economy is nothing more than the aggregations of all the thousands and millions of exchanges, either exchange for services, exchange for goods, exchange for labor. And business is nothing more than a series of, also a business is a firm doing some goal, but the economics of it is what all the integrated exchanges on it. And the difference between, and this is where I argue with libertarians don't realize that politics, even the Lockean kind of consensual politics that Locke and Hobbes wants to do, this idea we can have this, because that's why the leftists rightly argue and say that the liberals, like Hobbes and Locke, because Hobbes is a liberal, and father of liberals in a sense, that they reduce politics to economics. That's correct. But the problem is they don't understand the math. An economic trade is easy because it's what? Two-party trade. Two parties, buyer, seller. Therefore, a Pareto optimality is easy to get to a win-win situation. Very easy to get. As the number of n, this is a problem. If you want to know some math, some probability, once to get a decision, it's not just between two parties, but between 50 parties. You know how difficult it is to get all 50 people to kind of, even a majority to win. The greater the n, the lower the probability of a Pareto optimality majority point. So a Pareto point is the peak of utility, that all the parties are getting their peak ability of utility. In a two-party situation, you have a very high level of likelihood of utility, both parties achieving utility. Because remember, trade is purely consensual. If the parties don't want it, they can opt out. And if there's any force or fraud, a trade isn't negated. So economics is simple. That's why you are trying to understand larger social issues by using economic reasoning is kind of mistaken. That's why I kind of poo-poo academic agent when he does this, because it kind of is reductionistic. Why? Because I'm sorry, economic activity is a trade. It is nothing more than an aggregation of a two-party trade. Whereas a society is the interaction of every member. In other words, the number of people is exponential to the number of people. That's how many contracts you have to have. If you have 100 people, each 100 people have to have a contract with every 100 person. So it's 100 to the 100th power. Think of the likelihood of getting a majority power, a majority consensual point. Not to mention unanimity, because remember, a trade requires both parties completely agreeing.
Yeah.
So therefore, that's why if you understand that point, and the questioner asks, what did the questioner ask about again?
The question asked, well, this is just, are we still in virtue in politics, or
yeah.
are we?
No, I think we didn't.
No.
Maybe no, but that's what so I think in many ways, you can't. In other words, the problem is that political life is both consensual and non-consensual. Yes, it's better that the amount of non-consent be limited.
Yeah.
Because the more coercion you have, the less free you are.
Yeah.
But you can never escape things. And also we're totally, anyone who believes all human relationships are voluntary and consensual are just simply mistaken. I'm sorry, as someone trained in biology, I know we're sexually, we don't choose who we are sexually aroused by or who we want to screw with. Why? Because it's pheromones, it's chemistry, it's evolution at work.
Yeah.
Erections are telling us, hey, this person has genes I want. Your genes are saying to you, hey, that person has the genes we need to be better. So make babies with them, and then women have the same thing. So, so therefore, as we understand this, human relationships are complex. They involve both, because we don't choose to be born. We're born to parents who we don't. That's why that's why Locke had to attack Filmer and the whole this patrimonialism. In fact, this is why I argue that Locke gives us feminism, and Hobbes and Locke gives us feminism and Marxism. Not Locke. Hobbes doesn't give us Marxism, but Locke does. Locke creates labor theory of value because he says that the value of a thing is the amount of labor and effort you put into it. So therefore, that labor theory of value, and you get Marx. So virtue. No, virtue is of course virtue is required to live your life well.
Yeah.
And that and a good regime would have us living well. Okay. Mm-hmm. But the idea that we want good people, sometimes the problem is necessity. Yeah. Life, necessity is a bitch, and necessity will force our hand.
Yeah.
And sometimes in order to survive and that your people are able to succeed and be happy, may require to do things that you yourself. So Machiavelli isn't wrong, and the ancients knew that. The ancients were silent about it. Aristotle does not even. The word for sex in Greek is the things of Aphrodite. Okay, if they say the things of Aphrodite, that means. Therefore, that's how polite. The Greeks preferred silence, the idea that the truth should be beautiful, not ugly. So therefore, they would, if the truth has to be ugly, they'd rather be silent about it. They would acknowledge it, but they wouldn't openly say it or openly proclaim it in that sense.
Yeah. And you mentioned, I know you mentioned in one of your books, I'm going to hop in with a question on this. Mm-hmm. You mentioned in one of your books about how the different regimes represented different kinds of citizen or different kinds of man or what have you.
Yeah.
People, yeah.
In other words, the way of life, every in a community, the different types of people are going to have different ways of life. Farmers are going to be the farmers, if they're let's say they're small farmers and there's a lot of small farms, that's going to be a democratic population. But if the farmers are these big, giant, huge tracts of corporate land thing, that's going to be oligarchic. Farming will be oligarchic. So it will depend on how farming is. Is it family farming or small farms, or is it big corporate plantations? Yeah. Also, things like cattle, people who herd cattle. Well, if you're herding horses, that's going to be oligarchic. But if you're herding sheep and pigs, that's going to be more democratic.
Right.
So therefore, in other words, herding, fishing, in other words, what kind of labor? Now, commerce is very interesting because at one level, commerce, tradesmen, and shopkeepers can be democratic, but at another time, it can be if they become too wealthy and they have too much power, they become oligarchic. So therefore, we have to understand that commerce doesn't always require to move to oligarchy. In fact, commerce, I mean, American culture, commerce up until the 1950s was still mostly, I mean, American big business got horrible post 1980s when all of a sudden it was important to go to Ivy League schools. I mean, my God, up into the 1980s, you didn't have to go to an Ivy League school to get a job at the stock market. The stock market in New York or Chicago were basically kids who didn't even finish school half the time, or they went to a community college or something like that. I mean, it wasn't that you needed an education, but all of a sudden, because this myth that that these schools became the productions of elite, and that the stock market became a place to make money, then all of a sudden, the graduates of these elite universities came into the managerial system and captured it. This is why someone like Paul Hollander, to understand the kind of social dimension of what Burnham talks about. Burnham just gives a structural argument of why this happens, but to understand the kind of the way the new left took over the institutions, you have to look at someone like Paul Hollander in his book on the survival of the adversarial culture in Political Pilgrims. Paul Hollander's work about he basically is a Hungarian conservative who looks at he said he saw how the nomenklatura dominated there, and he looked at the so-called new class of the radical left and their students that they produced as a new class that was taking over American institutions after the baby boomers who came out of the universities and came out after Vietnam were so radical and once they took over the universities from the old 50s and 40s liberals, then the university became more left-wing. It kept on going further to the radical left. So that, and it's a cultural war. This is why people like David Horowitz David Horowitz always had a better understanding than the neoconservatives about the way what's going on here, because he was a leftist. David Horowitz is no neocon. David Horowitz is a repentant leftist who now sees the evil of the left. Where most of the so-called people who are really neocons were never leftists. They were children of the former leftists. And therefore, they're nothing like their parents. Like Bill Kristol was a hollow substitute of both his mother and his father. Or John Podhoretz at Commentary is nothing like Norman. Norman loves Trump. John hates Trump. Okay, why? Because these the children bought into the Republican establishment and became part of conservative Inc. They took over they became institutionalized, and once they became institutionalized, the left controlled them as they controlled the system. They played them, and because they got used to the money and the lifestyle they got into, they preferred not to rock the boat.
Yeah, I've increasingly been thinking of them in terms almost of addicts, like in the way they behave. Like there doesn't seem to be the big C conservatives. They don't seem to have any real freedom or spontaneity of thought. It seems to be just.
No, that's not true. The old paleocons did, but the old right got purged. Well, I mean, some of them deserve to be purged. The kooks deserve to be purged. I'm not going to defend today's wingnats and idiots like that. Anyone who wants to say Heil is a complete fucking wad, that's not conservatism. That's in fact, I love my mentor Mel Emmy Bradford, Southern conservative, who said in our environment, to merely conserve in this environment is to perpetuate the outrageous. Today, it's conservative not to overturn Roe versus Wade. It's conservative not to remove gay marriage. Gay marriage is conservatives believe in gay marriage and rights of homosexuals and things like this. I don't think that's not true. I think that's. I mean, ironically, the more things the more rights people have, the more likely you will produce the Hobbesian state of nature. and it will lead to the war of all against all. Because every group claiming they have rights over the system, that they demand extra protection and more goods at the expense of others. And when another group can't do that because you can't have white people having white identity politics is bad because of Hitler. Yes, Hitler is a monster. And I think the left uses Hitler to smear the right always, and it's always done this. But to be honest with you, there were a lot of people like the Randians. They're cuckoo. The whole cult of Ayn Rand. I have some people who are kind of sane Randians, but still Rand was a cult. I mean, if you know the stories about Ayn Rand, she was a flake. If you there's other kind of concepts like the John Birchers. Now, the original John Birchers were kind of sane, but then the later ones and the people who kept the faith, and believed in every conspiracy, they're just like cuckoo. I had a friend who kind of says that, and I always have to look at them like cuckoo. Okay, keep away. I mean, listen. I'm a member of the old white. In America, most leftists look at me and say, "You're a extreme, racist, rightist." Because my heroes were people like Wilmer Kendall, even though I'm a Yankee, I like the Southerners. The Southern agrarians. I think that they understood the limits of capitalism in a way that that libertarians still haven't grasped. My mentor Mel Bradford was very important. I mean, even though I'm not, I kind of say, listen, I'm a Yankee. I'm not a Southerner. I may sympathize with you think, but I'd still fight with the North. I'm sorry. Sometimes when I was younger, I thought I probably would have. Maybe for Civil War would be romantic, and I said, no, crap that. The Southerners are stupid firing on Fort Sumter. The second that was what Lincoln wanted, and the Southerners gave it to them, and therefore they lost. And I don't necessarily like the way what the Republicans did after the Civil War. Reconstruction was racism in the South owes nothing to slavery. It owns everything to Reconstruction and the way Reconstruction was handled. So if you want to understand why white people came to hate the blacks, it was, well, for 10 years you had basically Northern Republican military rule of the South.
Right.
Which enfranchised and empowered ex-slaves and stripped the voting rights of anyone who fought for the Confederacy. If you were in a militia and you swore oath to the Constitution, you lost. The 14th Amendment stripped your rights. The 14th Amendment destroyed the Southern economy because it made illegal all obligations to the Confederacy or any obligation to that. So I mean, if you can sympathize with them, but there was a stupid decision. It would have better not to fire in Fort Sumter and let them try it. Wait until if secession was going to work. I don't think secession was a good idea anyways, because I think if secession happened, then Turtle Dove would have happened. Turtle Dove's world would have happened, and we would have had wars amongst American states that like World War I had. I mean, World War I would have had. I think Turtle Dove is absolutely right. And I think the model that he predicts is actually, I think, is a good model, because the North would have sided with Germany, and if the Southern states didn't fire and did not fire on that, the French and the English who hated slavery would have probably recognized England for the economic exchange. And whereas the industrial, it would actually be Germany who would make an arrangement with the northern states. And what would have happened would have been the opposite. And in fact, that's why if that was the case, I think even Turtle Dove's rewriting of World War I was right. Now, his idea that the Southerners were going to be the new Nazis, that was cuckoo, but that was unconvincing. But the idea that First World War would have been completely different if the United States were or divided, where the North was with Germany and the South was with the Allies. It would have been a completely different thing. So, I mean, yeah, that's counterfactual history. But I'm saying is that it was therefore shooting at Sumter, basically, and not having a quick victory against the North led the England and France not to want to recognize that. Without recognition, England could not. The southern states did not have the economy to produce enough weapons and stuff to fight the northern.
Well, I like that you brought up what sort of got us on this train of thought. Mm-hmm. Because I've been sort of watching channels like Vouch's recently, and he'll go on things about why it's okay to punch Nazis, what have you. And I was on my 7th attempt to actually try and finish the whole thing of Herodotus this year. And he begins it by saying his goal with these histories is to make sure that the greatness of both Greeks and Persians are remembered. And there's a maturity in a lot of this ancient literature where they are willing to acknowledge even their most terrible and brutal enemies had virtues, had good qualities, or were capable of, at the very least, greatness of some kind. And that seems to be missing here. Hitler's not just a bad man, he's a demon.
Well, in Book 2 of the Politics, Aristotle talks about cities that are held to be well administered. He mentions Sparta, Crete, and Carthage. Now, if you know anything about Carthage, Carthage is not a Greek city; it's a Phoenician. It is the last surviving colony of the Phoenicians. Yeah, who was probably an empire that was probably a great empire around the 9th to probably 7th century. That's what Troy probably was. The idea that this Phoenician empire was this great and then what happened was some disaster happened that led probably the flooding of the Black Sea, which destroyed the agriculture. No, the Black Sea was originally a freshwater sea, and the Mediterranean was always something happened that led to more water coming into the Mediterranean, which then had the Mediterranean flood into the Black Sea and poison it. And you can see all these little cities that were mostly Greek or ethnically different Greek. I mean, we call it today Greek. Greece was basically 7 or 8 different ethnic groups. There's cities, 6th century, not 6th century, 8th, 10th century cities stuff that underneath the water they find. They go to, oh my God, that's agriculture. That's so. If you understand that that this great empire, something happened that led to its complete destruction. Yeah. And it was in the chaos of that the city-states, the cities, the polises emerged to come into this. First, there was these household tribal king rulers and then the rise of cities, and then the rise of cities and stuff. What was the question again to get to the point?
I was just remarking, like, it seems like
diversity. The Greeks understood the diversity of things better, because they wanted to recognize things. They still thought that they were the best, they were better, and that they should rule over them, but they could still see the virtues of them and the usefulness of them to a great degree. In fact, this is why I don't like the word. I mean, someone said, "Oh, you're a white supremacist." No, there's no such thing as white. I mean, the only time whiteness will emerge as a political. This is Eric Voegelin in the 1930s wrote two very good books on race, as a race in history and the concept of race and the history of political thought. The idea of, if we look at both race and ethnicity, nationhood. Yeah. These are very modern terms of in political thought. These are 19th century terms. Yeah. And the argument that there is such thing as a white political consciousness, well, not really. There's too much diversity. You're not going to. I mean, political consciousness requires a kind of homogeneity and a kind of commonness of purpose that simply doesn't exist in that sense.
Yeah.
Now, in the American context, in terms of what's happening post 1960s, with the rise of minority identity culture, particularly with the Black Power movement, then the Native American stuff and the Hispanic, the La Raza, as this stuff gets its peak in the 1990s, and it got to a peak in that sense. They really got institutional power in many places and sectors in the 1990s of universities. They controlled the university administrations. They controlled community groups, community school systems, school boards in the big cities.
Yeah.
Once these groups of identity politics got control, the only group of identity that was not allowed was white identity, and therefore, if white identity politics will emerge, it's going to emerge out of reaction out of identity politics, and that's why I don't like Jordan Peterson for a lot of reasons, but he's right on this point. I would say, but he doesn't express it right, because I will say, listen, everyone should love their nation and their people, because what's that famous line that John Adams said to the King of England, George III, when he went there, and the king asked him at the end of the kind of greetings of after he gave this very good speech, the king was very pleased by it. In fact, the HBO series Adams does a very good job on this scene. Adams says that the king says, "I hear of all the Americans, you, Mr. Adams, did not have a great love of the French." And Adams said, "Yes, that's true. I could not see anyone who'd love but his own country." And the king said, "No good man of honor would think otherwise." And therefore, this love of one's own is something natural. And this is why I criticize the Petersons who argue for individualism, because this individualism stuff is denying nature. There is in men to love their own kin group, their own things. Now, this doesn't mean, but excessive love of one own is bad.
Yeah.
Because it can be destructive and bad. And if you go too insular, this leads to genetic problems. Okay, come on, in breeding, diversity is actually biologically needed, but not too much diversity, because then what happens? In fact, this is another thing. Robert, what is it? Bowling Alone. What's his name? I'm gonna say Robert Palmer, but that's a
Here, let me find it for you.
Bowling Alone. It's Robert
D. Putnam.
Robert Putnam. Now he actually, I read Putnam. I knew him. But I didn't know this one article, and Ryan Falk mentioned this article in one of his things. And I said, because it published in the Scandinavian Political Studies Journal. So this is something he published in a out of the nowhere published that no one in Harvard or most American people would read. The stuff looking at racial diversity, and it's shocking because now in the body of the thing he kind of tones down his findings, but if you look at the data, he makes a very, in other words, social trust and social capital. You have to have homogeneity. Yeah. In other words, homogeneity if you have too much heterogeneity, if you have a high degree of heterogeneity, you don't have. In other words, if you have a society that's very diverse, there's no social trust, no social capital.
Well, that's why Aristotle wanted citizens to have properties, both on the inside and the outside of the city, right?
Yeah. And you had to have some understand that you shared a burden, that everyone shared the benefits of the city, and that therefore you couldn't have a situation where there's too much of where one group benefits at the expense of the other. If that got too extreme, there would be crisis and there'd be a conflict. But it's even more than this. Too much homogeneity does not lead to progress. So, and if you want a tolerant society, you need to have like 80% majority homogeneous population, and then it could tolerate 20% of diversity. Because in other words, the biggest mistake what happened was allowing the African Americans to congregate into the big, and the new immigrants to congregate in the big cities. What they should have done is they should have spread them to the small farms, teach them how to farm, teach them how to be self-reliant, and then put them in that it's always going to be 80%, 20%.
Yeah.
And that would have therefore we would have had the best of both worlds.
Yeah.
Societies
we wouldn't have concentrated social problems with racial groups, for one.
Yes, exactly. That's what. In other words, we've turned the urban groups into racial groups, and therefore we got to kind of. This is why people say this is apartheid. No, this is liberal. This is irony. Liberal policies produce apartheid. The reason why Europe has the problem of the cities, of the racial minorities are dominating all the cities in England and much of Europe, is because the socialist parties brought in these migrants thinking that these people would vote for them. And that they would destroy, they purposefully targeted traditionally conservative districts. And therefore they as a cynical move, people forget that Le Pen was created by Mitterrand. Le Pen's party, old man Le Pen's party was a party created by Mitterrand to discredit the French right. And to force and to ensure that the socialists would always win the presidential election, because centrists could never vote for the right candidate, because the rightists were getting votes from the Nazi National Fronters.
Yeah.
So,
I'm going back to Schmitt briefly. I was in a seminar last month, and we were talking about Schmitt's critique of liberalism, and the conversation was dominated by people who were critical of Schmitt being a Nazi and a part of the Hitler regime. But he made the very smart point that, look, had the Weimar Republic heeded Schmitt's critique of liberalism,
the Nazis would have not gotten power.
Exactly. So,
in fact, there's a famous thing: Schmitt only joined the Nazis out of the sense that if I don't go in there and try to give that this will go to disaster. Because he said that he thought he could be smart. His ego was too big. He thought he could convince Hitler and the other Nazis that to adopt his kind of theory, but his theory was completely at odds with what Nazi theory was. So, Vogelin is right about Nazis. Vogelin, their Gnostic ideology. Eric Vogelin's critique of political religion, one of his last books in Europe, first books in America, was a fantastic analysis of what Nazism is. It's a Gnostic ideology that has no relationship with science or even reason, and that's why Hannah Arendt relies on Vogelin's argument. Arendt's Origins of Totalitarianism is probably one of the most brilliant books, because I think to understand Islam and why radical Islam is so dangerous, because because radical Islam is the Islam that's the Islamic clerics in Iran and the Qaeda types or the Brotherhood types are not real traditional Islamic Muslims in that sense. Theologically, they're not looking to Al-Farabi. They're formed by Western ideas, Western philosophy and Western postmodernist ideas. They took them and applied it to the Quran. And therefore what they did was and I would argue in Vogelinian term, they Gnosticized the Quran to a degree. They created they took Marxist-Leninist party ideology. Therefore, the party elite becomes the vanguard that defines the ideology, and therefore the ideology now shapes the worldview of all the mass through Islam.
Have you heard of a book called The Impossible State by Wael Halak?
Oh no, there's so many things out there you could have known.
I know.
It's hard to keep up with them.
Yeah, that's a really good one though. He basically looks at specifically the Iranian regime, and he basically breaks this all down. It's like these are aspects of Islam up until such and such century, and these are all of the very Euro-oriented things that Khomeini had to bring in to make the Islamic Republic viable, and they really don't mesh. Like they're radical. But anyways,
so we've actually answered a lot of we answered 9, 10. I think even we got 11 indirectly. Let's talk about COVID, COV. How do they say it? COVID-19.
COVID-19. Let's justify the
Wuhan, the Wuhan flu.
Thank you.
This is actually going to be much more important for civilization, I think. It's going to change a lot.
Yeah.
By the way, and I think it will be. It may have actually more effect. In other words, the Spanish influenza was more deadly.
Yeah.
But it didn't have the same impact as this.
Yeah.
Because of modern technology and modern communications allowed for global kind of cooperation and immediate reaction. That kind of, I think if we didn't have the same, I mean, this would have been. If the Australian documentary does a good job about explaining the lies the Chinese covering up the early stages of this, even as early as December. If the Chinese were just simply honest, this would not have been as bad as this would have been less worse than SARS. If things were acted on more quickly.
It's basically
it's a variety mixed with bad stuff. And apparently, this was there's the American military and military intelligence argued that the commercial labs are so okay. There was arrest of an American professor selling biotechnology secrets, biosecrets from his university to the Chinese. Yeah. Well, so what happened was that the Chinese are so desperate trying to catch up to American biochemistry. This idea that China is great is a myth. Chinese are stealers of our technology. They always have been. Their students come to the West and they go into the elite universities and they then go back. Some stay, but most the ones that go back bring with them contacts, knowledge, and they make themselves very rich within the PLA system. The PLA, this is where the so-called neoliberals got wrong. The idea that market economy liberalized everywhere else. If we let them participate in the market, they'll become more. Well, we've had that 30 years of that theory, and it's produced a vicious authoritarian regime that can actualize the horror of Orwell's 1984.
Yeah,
with its social credit system and its ability of the camera states to police their large segments of the society.
When I see these articles praising China for their heroism in this circumstance, it makes me ill, because it's like what you're valorizing is a state that has been systematically executing those people.
Come on. But listen, the New York Times in the 1930s were praising Stalin and saying all this heroic activity going on there, trying to steal Will Durante of the New York Times went to the that's why Robert Conquest's book, The Harvest of Sorrows, should be must reading, because the complexity of the Western media in covering up the horrors of Stalin and Lenin. Hitler's Hitler's evil because to a degree that how he derailed human life the way. Not himself, but the ideology was so perverse that it could take normal, even technology, and use it as an instrument of mass orderly mass murder. But the Russians killed. The Russians were inefficient, and they were not as technologically sophisticated in their mass murder, but they did kill much more than Hitler.
Yeah.
And that it. To me, Hitler and Stalin are the commies and the Nazis are identical in this sense. They're a totalitarian movement that represents, and anyone who wants to join them are idiots because they lost. And you're not going to convince anyone that this is good. Only idiots are going to say, yes, let's join the Nazi party. I mean, come on. What is that Mel Brooks movie, the producers? Where they use comedy to mock the Nazis.
Yeah.
Why don't you be a smarty? Why don't you join? A nice Jewish voice is saying this. Hey, honey, why don't you be a smarty and join the Nazi party, right?
Yeah.
Mel Brooks. That's why the social justice left would make Mel Brooks impossible. I thank God I grew up in a childhood watching things like Mel Brooks, the producers, Blazing Saddles, and things like this. But honestly, China, COVID, it's going to change until there's a vaccine. Oh, but the vaxxers! Oh my God! He's a vaxxer. He's a vaxxer. No, come on. I'm a realist. I mean, some vaccines are necessary. I think a lot of times we went over on vaccines because of the pharmaceutical industry found a way to make money on it. But at the same time, I think vaccination is good because it does reduce the level. I mean, my God, look at California with Black Plague coming back. Okay, you need to have vaccinations, or else, in fact, much of these immigrants are coming without vaccinations, are causing much of the real social and medical problems in Southern California.
Well, go on.
But COVID-19 is going to change our habits.
Yeah.
It's going to change a lot of our democratic habits, and it's also bad enough because, as Tocqueville says, individualism is destructive of our social selves. By what Tocqueville understands by individualism is this inwardness to the self.
Yeah.
And that modern society destroys all the social instruments that used to keep us together.
Yeah.
And what the modern state does is the modern state tries to, in the name of equality, tries to control all of the other social organisms so that they don't compete with it, and then only the state is legitimizer what's right and wrong, or what's legitimate or not legitimate.
Well, I think Aristotle was very right. Like you need community to a certain extent to have to manifest your humanity fully.
Yes.
And the state system robs us of the ability to do that in bureaucracy.
Oh no, because the state system is the end of politics.
Yeah.
Hobbes does not want politics because Hobbes's view politics is contestation of groups.
Yeah.
And contestation leads to the Greeks call it stasis, which is not freezing. It means civil strife. And civil strife leads to civil war. Now, of course, not all civil strife is civil war. Civil war is the most extreme variety of strife.
Yeah.
The idea that you could have a society without strife is that's something very difficult. You're always going to have some level in the real world because of diversity and because of any group is going to be a diversity of interests.
Yeah.
And once you have a diversity of interests, you'll have contestation. Mm-hmm. So therefore, in a diverse, in any kind, even if you have a homogeneity, there's still going to be something that people would differentiate themselves on.
Yeah.
If it's not wealth, it'll be he's blonde hair and he's redhead. Okay. You know, remember that Star Trek episode where they were both were black and white half, but his color was at the wrong side. And that's why they hated each other. In other words, human beings will find there'll be some difference by which then contestation over utility and benefit will emerge.
Yeah.
So you can't escape it. So therefore, the best thing you can do is manage it. Okay. This is why, in many ways, Aristotle. That's why Montesquieu and Aristotle are very similar in that regard.
Yeah.
So, you want to wrap it up? Because we're on 2 hours.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been a pleasure having you on. You are welcome back anytime. And thank you very much.
No problem.
And thanks, people, for listening. And have a good evening or good afternoon wherever you are. And yeah.